Okay, I think we're going to go ahead and get this started. Again, my name is James Aldrete. I'm a board chair for Every Texan and just thrilled you guys are here. I want to welcome you to Texas Taxes and Social Justice. I think this is the least stressed and most geeked out, excited I've been on April 15th. But we're going to have a fascinating conversation today that really kind of highlights the basic policy premise that you can't achieve social justice without tax justice. I think y'all know, and so excited that we have so many of our partners here today, but for 36 years, Every Texan has been one of the premier experts on the Texas tax system. And so now we get to really have a kind of a deep dive conversation on how we can create broader equity in our tax system so we really can deliver a future where every Texan does thrive. You know, we're very grateful for our partners on this call who are committed to building shared prosperity in our state using public policy solutions. So our work is made possible by our many partners, but I also do want to give a real shout out to our Every Texan Thrives ambassadors whose belief in this organization and our mission is really what gives life to our vision. These are some friends and heroes, so we're incredibly appreciative of that. I want to take a quick personal note before we do get started. Yesterday, as many of you know, was a big day for Every Texan. We got to announce our new CEO and Executive Director, Marisa Bono, who's going to be helping lead Every Texan into this next chapter. So she doesn't officially start until May 5th, but we're very fortunate that she's here today to say hello, share some words, and just get to meet you all. Marisa, for me, has been a longtime friend, but she's been a lifelong social justice advocate and thought leader. She's brought extensive experience as a civil rights litigator, taking on especially a lot of the school funding cases, both in Texas and in New Mexico. She joins Every Texan after most recently also serving as the Chief Strategic Officer at Via Metropolitan Transit Authority in San Antonio, where she helped pass a bond initiative to bring equity to the transit system. She served as Chief of Policy for Mayor Nuremberg in San Antonio, where she focused heavily on equity in housing. And so she really is for the combined search committee that was part of this process, including staff and board members, the strong visionary leader that we believe Every Texan needs now at this critical time. We did do a national search, and Marisa just rose to the top because she has an exemplary record for championing social justice. She's got a very collaborative leadership style. And I think what you guys are going to learn too is she has an authentic approach to building coalitions across the state that's going to inspire more and more Texans to join us and working together to forge a more equitable future. So please join me in welcoming our new CEO, Marisa Bono.
Well, thank you, James. It's such an honor to join Every Texan, an organization that lives its values and firmly believes social justice requires public policy. For 36 years, Every Texan's expertise and advocacy has focused on creating equity and shared prosperity in our state, and I'm so thrilled to join that fight and join that legacy. I'm looking forward to officially joining on May 5th and meeting all of you then. I do hope to host some house parties, virtual and eventually in person, legislative visits, partner events. So there'll be plenty of opportunities for us to meet and learn more about how to support each other. Our work together is critical for Texas's future, and I'm excited to get to work. Thank you.
Thank you, Marisa. And at least what I saw yesterday was just a lot of excitement, and please note it's something that we've been dying to share this news, and we can't be more excited about the future. All right, so now I get to pass this off to the brains, and I'm gonna start off with our moderator, David Lee. David Lee is president and co-founder of the Texas Signal. He focuses there on strategic partnerships, business growth, and policy for the organization. Previously, his resume is long, but he was the Texas political director for Mike Bloomberg's presidential campaign. He was the National Finance Coalition's director for Beto O'Rourke's presidential campaign, and was also policy advisor for Beto's Senate campaign in 2018. He's a graduate of Georgetown University, majoring in government and political theory, and received a master's degree in international political economy from Stanford University. David is also giving on the nonprofit and the community end too. So he's a member of the board for Chicken and Egg Pictures to Educate All Children Victory Fund, and is a member of the Philanthropy Workshop. I'm happy to pass the mic over to you, David, and looking forward to this conversation.
Thank you so much, James. And Marisa, I'm so excited that you're taking the the reins at every Texan, and I'm just so excited for us to keep continuing to work together, and all of the energy that you'll bring to the team. So congratulations, and we truly look forward to working with you. All right, so it's such a privilege and honor to be, moderating this extremely important and timely panel. I feel a sense of imposter syndrome because I feel like this panel is just, the leaders, the thought leaders in the tax and policy realm for Texas and nationwide. And so I'm just very, very eager, and I'll try to keep up with them. But just to briefly introduce you all to our panel, we have Dick Lavine, who is the Senior Fiscal Analyst for Every Texan. We have Luis Figueroa, who is the Legislative Policy Director for Every Texan, and he is extremely busy as legislative session is going on right now. We also are joined by Cortney Sanders, who is a native Texan and is a policy analyst with Every Texan's partner organization, Center on Budget and Policy Priorities. So to start off, I'd like to, Luis, I'd love to know, why does Every Texan focus so strongly on tax policy as part of your mission to expand opportunity and equity for people of all backgrounds?
Thanks, David. Thanks for being here, and thanks everyone for joining us. It was great to see my former colleague Marisa give a little opening remarks, but let's dive right into it. Tax policy is, absolutely the moral document of our state. When you talk about what we value, it is reflected in our tax and budget policy. It reminds me of Franklin Delano Roosevelt's quote that many of you all know: "The test of our progress is not whether we add more to the abundance of those who have much, it's whether we provide enough for those who have too little." And that's why we here at Every Texan fundamentally believe that the budget and tax policy is at the core of social justice policy. Are you going to have enough funds to provide for the education of our children? You can talk about, high expectations for children. You can talk about, the closing the gaps or other metrics for success for education. But if you're not funding it, it's all just rhetoric. Healthcare, are you actually, giving the funds and putting the spending priorities on making sure that people have access to quality healthcare? Are you actually providing a safety net for folks who are unemployed, especially coming off this pandemic? It is at the core of social justice, and that is why we spend so much time trying to create policies and efforts that reflect every Texan's needs, and hope the legislature and the state and cities continue to reflect that moral imperative.
That's great. And, we know that tax policy is influenced by so many different factors, both good and bad. And Cortney, I'm curious if you could, I think we're tempted to think of taxes as neutral, right? With respect to race, especially. Tell us why it's important to use a racial equity lens when looking at the impact of tax policy.
Absolutely, and thanks for having me, Every Texan. It's good to be home, so to speak. And I think you're right. And I really appreciate this question, because I think it's important for us to understand that if we don't go to where we've been, then we won't get to where we need to go. And that really means looking at tax policy and saying, hey, is it race neutral or not? And as a policy matter, we know that white supremacy and structural racism has created and continue to perpetuate these disparities in power and resources and opportunities, and in ways that systemically disadvantages so many people of color. And it's really just to preserve an elite, largely white class, and undermine our collective well-being. I also just kind of want to, before I get to a little bit of the history of what I mean by that, just make it very clear that states do not raise revenue or collect taxes based on people's race. So David, yes, I understand why people are confused when they're like, hey, this is neutral. The state doesn't do it this way. But historically, racism and ongoing forms of discrimination and bias shape a few things. One, people's income, and two, the property that they own. And so in short, tax policy cannot be race neutral because of the country's long legacy of racism. And, today, Texas' major sources of revenue are from tax policies that are rooted in a racist past, where the outcomes that were intended for free Black people at the time are now still intended for Black, Native, Brown, and Asian people, and even white low-income individuals in this state right now. I'll briefly give a brief history lesson, and then continue the conversation with everybody on this panel, because I think it's such an important one. I want to first focus on property taxes, right? And really break down why tax policy isn't race neutral. So during the state constitutional conventions, think between 1875 to 1901, there was a reestablishment of white dominance following Reconstruction era. And the Reconstruction era is basically the time after the Civil War. And Alabama adopted this constitutional property tax limit. That they're kind of still one of the oldest property tax limits on the books today. And then it's installing highly restrictive property tax limits in Alabama's constitution that protected white property owners in their state from the possibility that if African Americans or their allies would return into power, they could do something like substantially increase property taxes on these white property owners to fund things like education and public services. So these white lawmakers said, nope, we're going to do it away with that in the state constitution. And today, 140 years later, it's still on the books in Alabama. Alabama's property tax revenue as a share of its income is still the lowest of any state in this country. And it seriously does harm for localities to raise adequate funding for schools and public needs. But then I'm going to shift gears, because not only does Texas raise revenue on property taxes, but we also do so with sales taxes. So there's a little history about that too. In 1932, Mississippi, adopted the nation's first modern retail sales tax. And this tax generally falls hardest on those with the least income, right? Because the sales taxes consume a larger share of people's income. If you have $1 and you buy something that's 50 cents and then it's a tax on it, then you have less of $1. And the state government urged adopting this new tax in part by emphasizing that the revenue would be used to reduce property taxes. We know who had property back in the day. And as a result, it would really shift the state tax base away from property owners and more heavily into consumers. And what that really meant in practice was that it was a reduction in taxes owned by mostly white property owners, and an increase in taxes for Black households that owned no property and had little else, income or things to tax except for what they bought. And, across the South, we just saw this adoption increase and accumulate over and over time. And so, David, when I hear you say tax policy is race neutral, it's a huge pause that I like to give a lot of people, because state fiscal policy often has been a part of the problem rather than progress. And that's why households with the least are paying the most in their state and local taxes as a share of their income. And we see that history has made it clear to why white households have the 87% of all wealth in this country. And at the top 10%, white households own 2/3 of all that wealth, and that Black and Latinx and Hispanic people are in low wage work, including all those women in those communities. And I can go on and on and on, but I'll stop there to say, if anybody don't get anything from this panel, I hope you realize that there is a rooted history and past to tax policy, and its racist history really helps illustrate how far we need to go as far as fixing our tax codes.
Yeah, thank you so much, Cortney, for kind of outlining that important historical perspective. I mean, these policies, didn't just appear out of nowhere, and so it's very, very important to keep that perspective in our minds as we look to change some of these policies. Dick, so in terms of how Cortney just laid out the historical perspective for us in terms of how we got to where we are, what does it mean for who pays and who doesn't pay taxes here in Texas? And also, I'm curious, like, where does Texas kind of stand amongst the southern states, like, in your opinion?
Let's start. I think I have a couple of charts, so we'll make sure that everybody has the same background. There it is. So this shows you, this is from 2019. There were some changes because of the school finance plan that passed that year, but it hasn't changed much. Texas has essentially a two-tax system. Most states have three major taxes: sales tax, property tax, and income tax. That's often known as the three-legged stool, because there's advantages and disadvantages of all three of those taxes. But when you have all three, it balances like a three-legged stool. We have a two-legged stool, and it has a lot of disadvantages. It's quite volatile. And as you'll see in a minute, of course, it's quite inequitable. But this is what we have. Even though Cortney's correct about the tax limitations, our Constitution was written in 1876. We still use the same Constitution. When it was written, there were limitations on property taxes in there, and there have been more added as recently as 2 years ago. But still, half of all taxes that Texans pay are property taxes. And then you can see the bar chart to the right shows that of those property taxes, half go to schools, and the other half get split pretty equally between cities, counties, and special districts, which are community colleges and hospital districts, and then lots and lots of smaller things. Then over on the left-hand side of the circle, you can see from around 8 o'clock to 12 is sales tax. We have a state sales tax of 6.25%. And in most places of the state, and certainly all the big urban areas, there's an additional 2 cents that goes generally to the city and the transit authority. So that's another 1/3 of all taxes paid in Texas. And then everything else, a gasoline tax, a cigarette tax, beer and wine, the franchise tax, which is paid our one business tax, and even severance taxes, the oil and gas taxes. All those taxes account for just a little less than 20%. So we're essentially a two-tax state, sales tax and property tax. Now the next slide shows you the consequences, which is, as Cortney was saying, it's hugely inequitable, or the technical term is regressive, because the people with the least pay the highest as a percentage of their income, and the people with the most pay the smallest as a percentage of their income. This chart is from a study the controller does every 2 years called tax exemptions and tax incidents. And what they do is they rank all Texas households by annual income and then divide it into 5 equal groups. And you can see the bottom group, which is 20% of all Texas households, have an income of about $32,000 a year, and they pay 16.8% of that income, that low income, in taxes. And this is direct taxes and indirect taxes. For instance, if you're a renter, you pay property tax. Now, you're not the one that writes the check to the assessor collector, your landlord does. But you can be sure that when your landlord is calculating how much rent to charge, the property taxes are figured in there. Sales taxes, all taxes are passed on in the end, either in lower profits for the owner, or lower wages for the workers, or higher prices for the consumers. And that's all reflected in this chart. The important thing to remember is the ratio from the people at the bottom 20% compared to the people at the top 20%, over about $157,000. That's more than a 4-to-1 ratio. That is terrible. And it's among the very, very worst of all the states in the United States. And let me just say, we do know how this breaks down by ethnicity. And that bottom 20% of all Texans, 16% of white households fit in that bottom group, but 23% of Hispanic households are in the bottom 20%, and 27% of Black households are in that bottom group that pays the disproportionate share of taxes. And we have one more chart, and this shows you this is really the whole story. They're same 5 groups sorted by income. And the gray bar on the left is the share of total personal income in Texas that's received by households in that income group. And the right hand of each pair of bars, that's in green here, shows you the share of total taxes people in that group pay. And in a state system, what you want is even just a proportional tax, so that the proportion of income and the proportion of taxes paid is about the same. So the bars would be equal height. And you can see Texas has nothing like that for 4 out of the 5 groups. For families up to even $157,000, the green bar, the share of their taxes paid, is greater than the gray bar, than their share of income. And only the top 20%, only those people with incomes over $157,000 make out under this system, so that they get 57% of income, which is a big problem in and of itself. And something Cortney mentioned, that's the underlying income inequality. And then it's multiplied by our regressive tax system, so they pay only 40% of taxes. So there's 2 major consequences of this. One is, if you're a working class family, middle class family, and you're trying to get ahead, you're trying to make a better future for your children, this tax system is holding you down. And if the state or the school district or whoever is trying to provide services to help people move ahead and give everybody an opportunity to thrive, we are not taxing the right people, because we know that it's the folks on the top whose incomes are growing the fastest. But we're not taking advantage of that. We're stumbling along trying to tax the people with the least, whose incomes are growing the slowest. And that's why we always fall behind in having enough money to do what we need to do as a state, or cities or counties or school districts. So that's all the numbers I'm going to be using, but it just gives you some background for the rest of what we're talking about what taxes we pay, and in fact, who pays them.
Mhm.
Yeah, and those are sobering numbers and data and graphs that the team just shared with the audience. And Dick, I'm curious, like, in terms of the collective potential that we have as a state, if we were to flip it and be like, if we were to have the best system ever, like, instead of looking at like how negatively this impacts, can you maybe kind of envision what like the best case scenario would be?
Sure, you just reverse everything I just said. And you'd have a progressive tax system, which is actually very unusual at the state level, but even proportional would be so much better off, because we would have faster growing revenue that we could invest in the future, so that all kids, wherever they live, would get an equal shot at a quality education and the chance to move up. People who need health and human services would have access to that. And even the mundane things, the infrastructure, the roads and water systems, or in the case of Texas, the electric systems, would be something that we could be proud of, instead of having to stumble along with inadequate infrastructure.
Exactly right. I'd like to just note that feel free for the audience to include your questions in the chat box or the Q&A function. And this is how you know a team is on top of it and legit. If we do not get to any of your questions, the team will be following up individually with your specific questions. And this is such an important issue, and I'm so glad that the team will be following up with every single question that you all have. Luis, if you are a donor, why would you care about Texas's upside down tax system that we're talking about today? And how does the tax system hinder an impact a donor wants to make on healthcare, nutrition, all of the things that Dick just mentioned?
Sure, absolutely. You know, we always frequently hear about state demographer Murdoch's projections of the future labor of Texas and where we're going in our state. And he made a very compelling case, you know, maybe 10, 15 years ago, about how if we don't invest in our education system, not only are the children of Texas, the Latinos and African Americans, going to suffer, but the entire state is going to see negative ramifications if we don't invest in our education system. And that includes, K through 12, putting, the funding into the special programs that we know that works. For example, English language programs, dual language programs. It includes the special ed fundings, the special weights that are given for these children that may need special services. But even as a staffer, I remember being horrified to know that there's not even a requirement that we have a counselor in every school in Texas. We have all these requirements about what you need to be in order to be a counselor or what a counselor needs to do, but there's no actually fundamental requirement that every school have a counselor. And when you think about all the needs that kids are going through right now in this pandemic, you think about all the emphasis on trying to get kids to, raise their achievement levels. And we can't even afford or require that every school have a counselor because of the funding behind it. You talk about higher education. Our current budget is really shortchanging financial aid in terms of Texas grants and the programs that are needed for low-income kids to attend state universities and even some private universities. There are special grants for them as well. If we don't fund those programs, we are going to have dramatic negative effects on our workforce. We're going to have to start bringing in folks from out of the state. We're going to have infrastructure needs that are going to start affecting bridges and other things. We're going to have healthcare ramifications. We are still the state that is leading the nation on the uninsured rate. That means that it's a huge burden on hospitals and county hospitals. And hospitals are starting to be very quickly on the brink of going under because they can't handle the amount of uninsured, uncompensated care. So there are huge ramifications. So if you're a donor and you care about living in a healthy state, if you care about having an educated workforce, if you care about having the infrastructures to know that bridges aren't going to collapse, we need a fair and equitable and sustainable funding source. And unfortunately, we've been going the wrong direction. I wanted to add a little bit to Dick and Cortney's presentation because we talk about the history and where we are, but the proposals that are coming out are going the opposite direction. Last session, there was a proposal to reduce property taxes by increasing the sales tax. That would, not only take the three-legged stool, and now we're at a two-legged stool, it turned into a one-legged stool. Would be on a pogo stick. This is not sustainable. This session, there are bills like House Bill 59, which would completely eliminate school taxes and come up with a new form of taxes to fund our schools that come from the local. That would largely be a consumption tax, a sales tax, or Senate Bill 1336 that proposes a spending cap. These are proposals that would prevent us from spending more on education and healthcare despite the need. So we have a lot of work to do in Texas, and we really need donors and our advocates and the people on this call to help support our work so we can start turning the tide.
Luis, you've been working on these issues with so many different constituency groups across Texas. I'm super curious, how do Texans think about our state and local taxes? Do these Texans support asking corporations and wealthiest households to contribute more to support these public investments?
Yes, there is a large sentiment that that corporations are not paying their fair share. We've seen that tested, and that has been a proven feeling among Texans that they're paying too much, and the corporations aren't paying their fair share. And we see some of that in the what we call the Chapter 313 and other tax incentives that allow corporations to not pay taxes. And we are actually in the middle of a battle about that. House Bill 1556 would extend those tax abatements for another 10 years and prevent corporations from not having to pay school taxes. So we often hear about, why is it that this corporation, that's making billions of dollars isn't paying their fair share? Well, the answer is it's the public policies that allow them to do that. And we need to start holding our legislators accountable for allowing those policies to continue those processes. So there is a growing support for additional revenue for education and healthcare. There is a sense that people feel that when we increase revenue, that the revenue isn't going towards the things that are needed. For example, I think a lot of people are frustrated that it'll go to law enforcement, for example, border security, on the border, as opposed to healthcare or education needs, or it'll go towards, a wealthy area of the state, as opposed to going into the communities of color that need the funding. So there is a two-part system to this, right? It's not only finding a good revenue source, it's also making sure that our spending priorities are focused on the people that actually need those services.
Absolutely. I wanted to make sure that this panel wasn't just doom and gloom, right? In terms of what's coming down the pipeline. And so let's shift now on what we can do. How can we change the rules of the game and create a tax system that works for every Texan? All right. So with that, Cortney, how can state and local tax policy be used to create this shared prosperity?
Yes, thank you, David. And I think Luis definitely set me up in talking about all the things that's not shared prosperity, right? So to get into it, I think as we respond to this moment, we should be really driving policies that can dismantle these long-standing inequities, right? And set us up for a stronger recovery and future, and really normalizing that every Texan should not just simply be surviving, but thriving in this state. And so there are just 3 ways that I'll talk about today, but so many others where states and localities can have tax policy create a shared prosperity. The first is to reevaluate the actors and the power within the tax system. Luis touched on hey, there are lawmakers making these policies, and these are some of the policies that are coming out the pipeline. The second thing is understanding that tax policy is not just about raising revenue, but to the point that Luis and Dick made, it's also about the spending too. So how can we be really intentional and have priorities around the spending? Someone once said, don't tell me your values, show me your budget, show me your spending, and I'll tell you what your values are. And so as Texans, we have to keep our lawmakers accountable, not just on the tax side, but the spending side. And I think the last is really being bold and push for creative ways to reform regressive tax structures. You asked Dick earlier, okay, how do we make that graphic look different? Well, being bold and creative takes a lot of guts, but it also means that we're looking for a better future. And while we know that Texas doesn't have an income tax, for example, that doesn't mean that has stopped other states that also doesn't have income taxes from making substantial change. We see, for example, in Washington State, they created an earned income tax credit, similar to what you see at the federal level for low-income families in 2008. And now, because of the American Rescue Plan and the surplus of income, this might be the first year or few years where we can see that fund actually be funded, and where a state that does not have income taxes actually starting to give back rebates to their low-income families who income is paying more in taxes because of the things that Dick showed you in that graphic, because their share of income goes to sales taxes or property taxes or other taxes in the state. And I really just want to pinpoint on that second point again and circle back and say, the public investments that we make have to be strong, and they need to be administered with equity in mind. And when we do that, that's where shared prosperity really happens. And when we think about these actors and who plays, go back to property tax assessments. I know that some people saw that article about a Black family in Austin posed as a white family, and things look different as far as what was on the market and how that property was assessed. These things matter. Back in a long time ago in the Jim Crow era, there were a lot of white politicians who were doing the tax assessments, and that created this now very archaic and opaque process to how we even assess property taxes, and where white households are paying the least in property taxes and households of color are paying more. And so if we kind of abide by these 3 principles to start, I really do think we can do things that are bold and exciting, like have circuit tax breaks, how we can expand our sales tax base to more services and things like that, to really put Texas on the map as not being the state that's known for the worst, but for the best.
Cortney sort of gave me the lead on some of the specifics of things we've been advocating for. For instance, on property tax, she mentioned something called circuit breakers. The idea is it's like a circuit breaker in your house. So when there's a surge of electricity, it cuts it off before your house burns down. This would be a way to link income, your property tax to your income. So if there's a surge in your property tax bill that exceeds a certain percentage of your income, there's a buffer that cuts it off so it doesn't take too much. And the big advantage of that is in many states, renters also can take advantage of a circuit breaker because, as you know, I don't have to explain, people at the bottom part of the income are not generally homeowners, but they're renters, but they're paying property tax anyway. And this would be a way to equitably buffer them from having to pay a disproportionate share while people with high-end homes pay on their full value. Another thing we can do is homestead exemptions for among homeowners. Cities and counties give a percentage exemption up to 20%. Well, 20% of $1 million home cuts their taxable value by $200,000. But 20% of, let's say, a $200,000 home cuts it by just $40,000. But what you could do is have a flat dollar homestead exemption. So everybody, say, got $100,000 off their taxable value. That would help somebody with a $200,000 home. They would cut their taxes in half, and it would give something, but not too much, to the person with the $1 million home. And it would help equalize the burden. And then talking about sales tax. And you saw that sales tax is a major source of revenue for the state. Well, the sales tax in Texas was established in 1961. 20th century manufacturing economy, people made and bought and sold things. Well, we're in the 21st century, and it's a service economy. And Texas actually does better than a lot of states in taxing services. But what it does not do is tax business and professional services. It doesn't tax lawyers and accountants and stockbrokers and real estate agents and management consultants. I mean, that's where the growth in the economy is. And you can guess what kind of people have lawyers and accountants and management consultants and all the rest. And we need to subject them to the sales tax, just like when other ordinary people buy things in the store. All these things could be done, wouldn't require massive changes in our tax system, but would help us move forward quite a bit. We'd have more money and we'd be raising it in a fairer manner.
I mean, a lot of these things, you know, it's gonna have to, we're gonna have to take a long-term kind of perspective in order to make this whole system more equitable, right? And so, you know, at Signal, you know, we think of in terms of building out a media ecosystem that is based on truth and facts, and you know, we're looking at it, you know, 10 years down the road, right? And so I'm curious if, this is for Luis, at Every Texan, what are the long-term kind of policy solutions that you guys are fighting for in order to make this system more equitable?
Absolutely. So, you know, long term, you know, as Dick and Courtney pointed out, we're looking to flip the script, right? Turn our regressive system into a progressive system. But there are steps along the way to get us there. And so I think, first of all, you know, we can start, you know, taxing, you know, the corporations that are not paying school taxes under Chapter 313. That has a very long-term impact. That is not something that's going to be felt in the next 2 years. That's going to be felt something in 10 to 20 years when we can draw that revenue. When we talk about the sales tax and starting to impact that, that is also a long-term issue and reflection of bringing in new revenue sources. So Dick has this whole report and in terms of who does and does not pay taxes. And so much of it is antiquated. You know, we haven't updated the gas tax in so long. We were giving this sales tax for long ago because there's an industry that, you know, was very prominent back then, and now things have changed. So just updating things like that would go a very long way. You know, ultimately there was a proposition last session that can close the door on the income tax. You know, one day we would like to reopen those conversations again. That is a long-term conversation, but when we start, as people start seeing a tax structure that is more equitable and sustainable, and seeing the spending benefits of it on our education and our healthcare needs, we can start moving in that direction. So it's a long-term conversation, and Dick has really been leading the way in keeping people honest about who is paying, who's not paying, and what we're paying for, and what was the basis for that. So I'll turn it over to him if he has any more thoughts on that.
Oh, I have a long list of other things we could do. The ones I mentioned are all perfectly plausible within our current tax system. Let me explain a bit more about Chapter 313 that Luis has been talking about. What that is a system of school property tax abatements, where the corporation goes to the school district, asks for these 10-year abatements where they pay on much less than the full value of their property. And in addition, and this is the most insidious part, they make payments to the school district called payments in lieu of taxes or revenue protection payments. So the school district, through the school finance system, loses nothing. The state doesn't say you could have been taxing this, but you're not, but we're going to cut back our state aid. But they do get to keep these payments from the school districts, so from the companies. So school districts always say yes. It's costing the state $1 billion a year to make up for the lost property tax revenue that could have been coming to our schools. And there's a bill now that would just blow that wide open, make more projects available, make the amount of the abatement even greater. And this is inconceivable. But the fiscal note, the estimate from the Legislative Budget Board of what a bill would cost, shows how it phases in because it takes a while for these projects to be built. But from, I believe it was 2033 to 2047, the state would be giving up $55 billion in school property taxes that should be going to educate all our kids. It's a terrible, terrible program. It's up for renewal this year, and we are fighting as hard as we can to keep it from being renewed, or at the very least, postpone the debate for another 2 years so we can marshal our forces and see what we can do to, if we can't stop it, to cut it way, way, way back. So it won't be costing us $55 billion. And that's House Bill 1556 that Luis mentioned is the leading bill on this. It's been heard in Ways and Means, but has not yet been voted out of committee. So it's important to write to your rep, especially if they're one of the 11 members of the Ways and Means Committee, and tell them corporations benefit from a good school system and an educated workforce. They should contribute to creating that.
Right. I'd love to get into these incredible audience Q&As. The first one is from Sister JT Dwyer, who's joining us from San Antonio. What other states do not have state income tax? Has Texas ever seriously considered a state income tax? If not, why not?
Well, I think there's 9 others that don't have an income tax, and a lot of them are special situations. Wyoming has coal, and Alaska has oil, and New Hampshire doesn't have much of a state government. But there's the state of Washington, which is an equivalent kind of modern state, doesn't have an income tax. What they do have is an enormous sales tax, just like us. And that's the problem. You have an unbalanced tax system if you don't have all 3 legs of the stool. Now, in the 1980s, Bob Bullock, when he was lieutenant governor, proposed an income tax. There was a backlash to it, and there was something put in the state constitution written by Bullock that was actually not a bad deal. It said you couldn't have an income tax without a statewide referendum, and if the people did approve an income tax, 2/3 of it would go to reduce school property taxes, and 1/3 of it would be dedicated to education. It was never taken up, and then last session, there is a new constitutional amendment to supersede this one that just says no. Total prohibition on an income tax. It requires a 2/3 vote of each chamber to be put on the ballot. It got exactly a 2/3 vote in the House. One vote would have made the difference. It went on the ballot and it was approved. So it's now currently in the Constitution. And if we want a state personal income tax, we're going to have to go through a constitutional amendment procedure just like they did 2 years ago to prohibit it.
Cortney or Luis, do you want to add anything?
I definitely want to add that, even though you don't have an income tax, he mentioned Washington State. Again, there's still options out there to achieve the same goals, as far as just getting more money into low income communities and not just having it, taken and stifled with the higher income community. The other thing I want to mention is that Dick said something. He said 2/3 votes. In history, we also know that 2/3 votes is also known in the tax world as called supermajority votes. And that was also rooted in a history of a racist past. And so while we're thinking about the rules of the game, it's also important as voters for us to make sure lawmakers are not using these racist rules of the game in the legislature to continue to perpetuate inequitable tax policies, because that's exactly what happened in Texas, right? They said no to income taxes. And then they said, and then we're going to use this very racist policy to make sure that doesn't happen. And so I just wanted to add that 2 cents in there as well.
Okay, I just want to make clear though, I do know a lot of states have a supermajority requirement to raise taxes. Texas doesn't have that.
No.
This was because it was a constitutional amendment.
Mhm.
And it went into the Constitution because the voters approved this prohibition, despite our best efforts to educate them.
We have a question from Virginia, from Laredo. With the oil and gas industry in systemic decline, Texas's rainy day fund and severance taxes that go towards school funding are also in decline. What are some ways that Texas can plan for this transition so that our schools and other essential state services don't suffer?
Okay, well, it is true that the oil and gas industry seems to be having some problems, hopefully for good reasons, because they're not helping on the problem of climate change. But the state of Texas is not as dependent as it used to be on oil and gas revenue. In the 1980s, there was a problem with OPEC, oil prices fell, and they had to have a special session just to cut the budget because they were so dependent on our oil revenue, they couldn't even make it through the budget. It's no longer true, and most oil and gas revenue, in fact, now goes to either the rainy day fund or the highway fund. So we're not as dependent, and our schools especially are not as dependent, except for through the permanent school fund, which owns some oil producing land. But what it says is we can't live off the fat of the land any longer the way we did 40 years ago. We have to bring our system up to date. And that's why we keep talking about just modernizing it, just recognizing where's the economy at now. The economy is a service economy, and we have to change our tax system to reflect the world we live in now, not 40 years ago when it was all what was a crude and cotton and cattle. Not true any longer.
Great. We have a question from Ken Janda. He asks, isn't the disproportionate share by lower income also true of federal income taxes as well?
Not of the federal income tax, but when you include payroll taxes, the Medicare tax and Social Security tax, that's what hits working people the hardest, not the federal income tax per se.
And the reason for that is simply because, when you're filing your taxes, you get those EITCs, those earned income tax credits, the child tax credits. Because we're taxing income, you see the more progressivity into the federal taxes versus in the state taxes majority of the time.
Yeah. In a lot of ways, we're kind of preaching to the choir in this audience. It's between 11 and noon on a Thursday talking about tax policy, right? I'm curious, each of you, if you can kind of give us a headline kind of talking point that we can take to our friends, our other spheres of influence to talk about this very, very important issue.
Let's go.
Headline to summarize this issue? Is that what you're asking?
Yeah, or like something that we can like kind of take away from this and share with our friends and family for them to also care about this very important issue.
Yeah, I mean, for me, it's based, it's back to the title, that if we want to enact social justice policies, we need to look at tax policy. You can't separate the two. and say, oh, well, I support education, but, I don't really want to get into tax and budget policy. Ultimately, if you care about education, if you care about, lives, if you care about healthcare, if you care about infrastructure, and if you care about social justice, it comes down to tax and budget policy. Otherwise, as I said, it's just rhetoric. The budget is our moral document that defines who we are and what we actually care about. And that's at the heart of it. So sorry, that was probably more than a headline, but but I think I got the gist across.
Yeah, great.
I don't know, my short headline would be, we're all in this together. We all benefit from public services, and we should all contribute as we best we can to supporting those public services.
Absolutely. I would say, these policies might have been implemented hundreds of years ago, but they still impact us today. So we need to do our part to ensure that we have a more progressive state, and a state that cares about every Texan surviving and thriving.
Love it. Love it. Now, for those of you who ask more specific questions, the Every Texan team will be going into, we'll be responding to those individually. But just like a last quick question, because several of you asked this, in terms of like, what are the solutions that can help change the system specifically? And also, are there any specific bills? I know you guys mentioned a couple that we should, write down and make sure to take note of.
Anyone to go first?
Go for it, Dick.
Well, I'll just mention it's not a major bill, but it's just an example of things that can be done. This is actually a bill that's going to be heard in Ways and Means this Monday morning at 10 o'clock. It's by Representative Donna Howard from Austin, and House Bill 321. I am pretty sure it's the number. And what it would do is exempt feminine hygiene products. It's just a small example, but it's a medical necessity. For women of a certain age, there's no choice about it. We don't have a sales tax on prescription drugs. Through some of our work some time ago, we don't have a sales tax on over-the-counter drugs, because we have enough problem with people don't have access to healthcare. If they don't have a doctor, they can't get a prescription, but their kid's still sick, so they need to buy over-the-counter cough medicine. This is just a way to sort of recognize real people's lives, things that people need, and it costs a bigger percentage of a family that doesn't have much income. We shouldn't be taxing them on it too.
I totally agree. I wanted to just mention something in the chat that Lisa Tamayo, my friend, pointed out about campaign finance reforms, and just that that those are also moral documents, because I do think that is something worth highlighting. And one of the reasons why we decided to go after Chapter 313 and specifically House Bill 1556 is to shine light on it, because so many of these provisions in the tax code are hidden in the darkness, and nobody knows about them. And they're funded through corporate lobbyists behind the scenes, and there's nobody holding them accountable for it. And so that those corporations are definitely funding elected officials through campaign contributions. And so we wanted to shine a line on it and saying, this is the cost. This is the impact on kids, on healthcare, on other issues, that if we're going to give secret tax breaks and abatements, then we're going to shine a light on it, and we're going to call out people who are supporting it and vote on it. And so thank you, Elisa, for pointing that out, and please join our campaign to push back against that.
It's a perfect segue into getting people on this call and our friends and family to also support Every Texan's very important work. As you can tell from today's incredible panel, Every Texan advocates for people-centered public policy solutions, thanks to all of your generous contributions. Their monthly Sustainer program, The Collective, provides indispensable support for Every Texan's advocacy and policy expertise. I mean, these guys are like are policy warriors, and you know, I feel like they should be glorified as such. And so please consider joining this important work by joining the collective to build a just and equitable Texas. And it's just been, you know, I can sleep easier knowing that these guys are on the front lines every day, in and out, focusing on this for every Texan. And so really, I hope you take a look at supporting this incredible organization, and also be on the lookout over the next couple of weeks. Every single member of our audience today will be emailed a limited edition Texas Taxes pocket guide, which is going to be extremely helpful as you kind of talk about these issues among your spheres of influence. And so please take a look through that and make sure to have it handy at the dinner table. So with that, I mean, just thank you again to all of the panelists, all of the audience members. This was just such a important and timely panel, and thank you all for spending the time.
Thank you, David. Thanks for being here.
Great. Thank you all for coming.
This was great. Thank you.